hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining this session today. So firstly, just a quick note to let you know that the session today will be recorded. We'll just start with a brief introduction. So I'm Anna Coburn. I'm a principal consultant here at SLR, based in our Singapore office. I'm also joined on the webinar today by my colleague Jen, who's also based in our Singapore office as well. So today we'll be focusing on Singapore's mandatory climate disclosures. We'll start with a very brief introduction just to SLR and what we do, and then move into a recap of the Singapore mandatory climate reporting requirements. And then we'll review a bit on progress to date, both in Singapore but also globally because of finance streams and supply chains. This will impact what's happening here in Singapore as well. And then we'll move into some frequently asked questions from the work that we've been doing in supporting clients to adopt the requirements. And if we do have time at the end, we'll do a Q&A session. But any questions that are in the chat and not answered, we'll make sure to collate and do a follow-on after the webinar as well. So just to provide a brief overview of a little bit about SLR. So we're a global advisory and we work with clients in a number of different sectors. So some of the sectors that are here on the screen. Jen and I are in our strategic advisory team, but we also have over 45 technical services from things like ecologists to energy engineers to implement the strategies that we develop and turn some of the advice that we give into on-the-ground action as well. So as I mentioned, we are a global consultancy, but we do have many offices here in APAC. And if you do want to know more about the services that we offer, then please do reach out to us as well. But for now, I'll just hand over to Jen to get into the main content of the webinar.
Thanks, Anna. So we move on. Yeah. So I'll first start off with a brief recap of the Singapore requirements, what has been happening, and then following that, the second part of my session will be looking at zoom out and globally how things have been progressing with the ISSB adoption. So what we have on the screen here is a little bit of a timeline, but basically climate reporting has gained quite a bit of traction since the formation of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So that's the TCFD for short. In 2022, the Singapore Exchange, also known as SGX, mandated issuers to align to this on a comply or explain basis. And following that year, in 2023, the ISSB released the IFRS S1 and S2. So that will be what we're kind of focusing on this session. And with the launch of this S1 and S2, the IFRS has taken on the responsibility that was previously held by the TCFD. Following that release, in 2024, Singapore then confirmed the adoption of these standards, and with the confirmation of these standards, confirmed the changes to the listing requirements. And with the confirmed changes in 2025, the year we are presently in, many companies are now starting to work on their sustainability report to ensure that it's aligned with the S2 or the S2 standard, which is also known as the climate disclosure standard. Next slide, please. So what's the difference between the S1 and S2? So they focus on different aspects of sustainability. So what you have on the left side of your screen, which would be S1, focuses on the general requirements or disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. So some of the things they cover would be key principles, reporting requirements. So these would be conceptual foundations, such as asking issuers, asking companies to disclose details such as their filing dates, the kind of uncertainties that they face in their reporting, any connected information, requiring users of the standard to define what is a short, medium, and long-term horizons. So some of these details they do mention of people who use the standard to disclose them. Another thing to note is that it does not just focus on climate-related risks, but what's detailed within the S1 standard covers all material sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So this could change depending on the focus of your organization. So for you, there could be nature risks, there could be biodiversity risks, there could also be water scarcity issues. So that's what the S1 does. In terms of S2, which would be the one on the right of your screen, focuses solely on climate-related disclosures. So it fully incorporates the TCFD recommendations. So if you do go into the standard, you will see that those familiar 4 pillars from the TCFD. So this would be your governance, your strategy, your risk management, metrics and targets within the standard. So those would be some familiar terms that we would see. It also requires industry-based disclosures through the disclosure of industry-specific metrics. So looking at S1 and S2 in the Singapore context, which is what we are talking about today, focusing on, organizations are asked to apply S1 when preparing their climate-aligned reporting according to the S2 standard. Right. So now that we know what the S1 and S2 are about, the next question will be who needs to disclose, when do you need to disclose? So with the changes in the SGX requirements, they've adopted a phased approach in terms of which companies will need to disclose and when they will need to disclose certain components. So in terms of who needs to disclose, looking on the left of your screen, all listed issuers will be required to publish their first ISSB, aligned climate-related disclosure in FY 2025. So what this means that the report will be published in the year of 2026 with your FY 2025 information. This will be followed by the large non-listed companies, which will start in FY 2027. So as I mentioned again, with the the report will be published in 2028 with your FY 2027 data. For small non-listed companies, that inclusion is still being reviewed. So currently at the moment, there's no timeline out for the inclusion of the small non-listed companies. Moving on from who needs to disclose would be when and what companies need to disclose. So for the disclosures, you will need, as I mentioned earlier, if you referring back to the left side of your screen in terms of when your first year of publication need to be done, so that ISSB aligned climate reporting first year would apply. So if you're a listed issuer, you would have to publish that aligned climate reporting in FY 2025. If you're a large non-listed, you would have to do that in FY 2027. The existing timeline applies. So that will be that the sustainability report for its financial year will come out no later than 4 months after the end of the financial year. So that still remains in the first year of reporting. In the second year of reporting, the sustainability report will need to be issued at the same time as the financial report, unless you are seeking external assurance, which I will cover in the next slide. Aside from that, the organization, given that this is in the second year, would have to include comparative information. The last 2 elements that you see on the slide, which are your limited assurance on scope 1 and 2, reporting on scope 3 emissions. The implementation dates are currently pending review. So the reason for that would be from the feedback that was received during the consultation, the SGX RECO noted that various companies do face difficulties in reporting your scope 3 emissions. So that's under review. They will review the issuer's experience in reporting scope 3 emissions before they revisit this and set out an implementation roadmap once more. In terms of assurance, if you are already seeking assurance, please continue to do so. And if you have not, there will be, that timeline is still pending review. Going back to scope 3, if you are also already reporting scope 3, you're encouraged to do so. If you have not yet reported on scope 3, given that it is something that's pending under review, at this moment, it would be a good time to actually build up the capabilities in the interim period. Next slide. So now that we know who needs to report, what needs to be done, in this slide, we'll cover the key differences from the previous SGX requirements and the proposed updates. So with that alignment of the climate disclosure with ISSB, that suddenly has created a shift. So in terms of notable updates, starting off with compliance. So previously, climate reporting was mandatory for selected industries. So that would be your financial industry, agriculture, food and forest, energy, materials and buildings, and transportation. So these were the selected industries that it was mandatory for, with the remainder of the issuers in other industries on a comply or explain basis. With the proposed update, it is now mandatory. It will be mandatory for all listed issuers from FY 25. In terms of the climate-related framework, with that shift towards ISSB, previously reporting was done following the recommendations of the TCFD. Now the proposed updates for the SGX requirements require climate reporting in accordance with IFRS S2 and the application of the S1 insofar related to climate-related disclosures. There are no requirements for a statement of compliance for now. In terms of timelines, companies used to be able to issue their sustainability report within 4 months after the end of the financial year. So this is what I was mentioning in the previous slide. If you are seeking external assurance, you have a bit of a leeway, which is 5 months. However, with the new updated SGX requirements, you must issue your sustainability report at the same time as your financial report after your first year of mandatory reporting. So during your first year, that timeline still remains the same. Once you hit the second year of that ISSB aligned climate reporting, you would have to issue them the same time as your financial annual report. However, if your sustainability report is externally assured, then 5 months still applies. So no later than 5 months after the end of the financial report. In terms of assurance, the sustainability reporting process used to be subject to internal review. At this moment, no internal review is required for the new requirements on sections that have already been externally assured. And in terms of materiality, for the previous SGX requirements, materiality used to be able to be signed off by the leadership. That term has now been changed. So with the proposed updated SGX requirements, materiality has to be signed off by the board. And not only that, the definition has to align with that of S1. In terms of the structure of the report, remains the same. So it will still has to detail the material ESG factors, the climate disclosure policies, practices, and performance, your targets, the framework that you intend to use for your report. There has to also be a board statement, and the governance structure should also be detailed. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So that will be the recap on the Singapore requirements. So we'll zoom out a little bit more and look at how the global adoption of ISSB has been progressing. So in the past 12 months, it's been quite clear there has been notable movement towards the ISSB adoption. And what we've seen is that in the past 12 months, there are several jurisdictions have decided or are taking steps to really introduce the ISSB standards in their legal or regulatory frameworks. Together, these jurisdictions actually represent quite a sizable GDP globally. And then within a span of 6 months, from October 2023 to March 2024, we've seen that it's been reported by the IFRS that more than 1,000 companies have started to reference the ISSB in the reports, kind of signaling that they are aware that this has come out and they should move towards that. And closest to home in Asia Pacific, 8% of Asia Pacific companies in both the G250 and the N100 groups have started to reference the ISSB in sustainability reports. So zooming in from that global view down to the Asia Pacific, you can see that movement is pretty uniform and everybody is broadly aligned with moving towards adopting the ISSB and disclosing their climate disclosures. Next slide. So closer to home, looking at some of our neighboring countries, many of them have implemented or are planning to implement the ISSB. So if you look at the companies towards the top of the slide, you can see a lot of them already have plans to implement them. And then amongst of the examples that we have here, a lot of the timelines, as you can see, they align quite closely with what Singapore is doing. So with the exception of countries below, which are Indonesia and China that we have on the slide, who are still in the process of consultation. So this would be actually very useful for your organization, especially if you have operations that span across these areas. So that would be helpful in terms of knowing that if you're reporting against the Singapore SGX new requirements, you actually be able to comply with those in Hong Kong, Malaysia, or India in that case. Of course, understanding that even in these countries, despite there being some broad alignments, there will still be some slight differences in terms of details of alignment as well. And I believe that marks the last bit of the progress today. I will now hand over the time back to Anna, where she will cover some frequently asked questions that we have received from working with some of our clients.
Great. Thanks very much, Jen. So yeah, one of the first questions that we get when clients are starting this journey is what are the key elements that's included in IFRS S2 that needs to be included in the sustainability report. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, there are various sections of the sustainability report, from material ESG factors to targets to the board statement. The content from IFRS S2 will largely sit in the climate-related disclosures section of your sustainability report. And as Jen mentioned earlier on, the content and the structure of IFRS S2 is largely consistent with that of TCFD. So if you've already disclosed a line to TCFD, then this will be a good starting point for IFRS S2 as well. So there remains the four key pillars. So governance, firstly looking at the governance processes, controls, procedures used to monitor, manage and oversee the climate-related risks and opportunities. Then looking at strategy. So what's your company's strategy for managing significant climate risks and opportunities? So this might also be where you include sections on a climate transition plan or the resilience and adaptation measures in place to mitigate against risks as well. Then the next section is on risk management, so how companies identifying, assessing, managing and mitigating climate risks. In this section as well is where companies will use scenario analysis to help them identify some of these risks, and might also talk to how these risks are integrated into your wider ERM or risk framework as well, and where you would also start to disclose what your definition of materiality is and how you prioritise and rank risks as material. And then the last section is on metrics and targets, so information used to measure, manage and monitor these climate risks. So this might be how you're measuring greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas reduction targets, as well as any sector specific metrics as well. So another question we sometimes get asked is if you currently align with TCFD as per the SGX requirements, what to do in the interim. So this may be the case for many companies, as TCFD was required for many companies listed on SGX, and before the IFRS S2 requirements become mandatory in 25 or 27. So there's no kind of strong right or wrong way to do this, but we do recommend that companies start by performing a gap analysis against the IFRS S2 requirements to consider where requirements are met maybe through previous alignment to TCFD, and where there will be further work to do. So then the companies can consider for these gaps in disclosure, whether it's information that's quite easily accessible, so might need further examples of climate competency or further disclosure information. So it might be something that you're doing, but you've not explicitly disclosed before. And this could then be incorporated into that interim report. And then companies can also use the gap analysis to identify something longer term. So perhaps like quantifying the financial impacts of climate risks. So it wouldn't be added to the interim disclosure, but within the disclosure, you can use the gap analysis to highlight where you're making progress against the IFRS requirements whilst still meeting requirements against TCFD. So I think in the short term, start with a gap analysis, consider what could be included in an interim report, and continue alignment with IFRS S2. Jen's maybe touched on this question in the first section as well, but many companies ask what about the IFRS S1 standard. So Jen mentioned at the beginning of the session that S1 includes key principles and general requirements, as well as the main content, including sustainability related financial information, not specific to climate, but could consider other things like nature or water or human capital. In Singapore, it's just climate related disclosures that are mandatory, so you don't have to include information pertaining to other sustainability related risks and opportunities outside of climate. However, S1 should be used for general reporting requirements. So for example, some of the key principles in conceptual foundations, looking at things like filing dates, definitions of uncertainty and materiality, connected information and the use of time horizons as well. So just as a recap, S1 has not been prescribed, but companies should use S1 in relation to climate-related disclosure. And this may change in the future as well. Jen's maybe touched on this one briefly as well, but looking at requirements for external assurance and if assurance needs to be done under a certain standard. So currently external assurance is not mandatory, but it is expected that limited assurance on scope 1 and 2 emissions will become requirements for listed companies in FY27 and non-listed companies in FY29. So this is an ongoing consultation and hoping to hear the outcomes of this shortly. If you do already have external assurance in place, or you do have limited assurance over your emissions, then companies are kind of expected perhaps by external stakeholders or recommended to continue with this practice. And then there's also a list of assurance requirements and standards that are outlined by SGX as well. So this is a question that we've had from quite a few companies. So if a company's listed in Singapore but have large operations internationally, will we have to comply with other jurisdictions' regulations? So as an example, I've recently worked with a client where we've involved our Latin American and European colleagues to confirm the very specific requirements in that region for a company of certain size. This will be dependent on the jurisdiction in which you operate, but also the size of your operations within that region as well. So it should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And we've got some examples here of the requirements for Singaporean companies that might have large operations in Europe, so having to align with ISRS, and similarly some companies in Singapore that might be listed in Australia, so having to align with ISRS as well. When we've worked with companies facing this challenge before, the best way to deal with it is to review and collate all the requirements globally, so utilising local experts as well. And remove the duplicates. So essentially you would have one complete list of requirements to work with at a group level, and this list of requirements would align with IFRS S2, ASRS and ASRS as well. But as most regions follow IFRS S2, then these should be relatively similar with some local nuances as well. So just another question that we've had through working with clients, if there are any circumstances in which you wouldn't publish financial information on climate risks or opportunities. So there are some caveats that come from the IFRS S1 standard. So for example, if you are looking at the financial impact of a new product, this could be considered commercially sensitive information and doesn't need to be included in your report if it is going to give peers an advantage, for example. Another instance might be disclosure of financial information where the measurement methodology is highly uncertain. So as an example, if we're looking at carbon pricing, there's a robust data set. The databases are well known and peer approaches are likely to be similar. But on the flip side, if we're looking at a transition risk, say of customer pressure or new product opportunities, they're a lot more difficult to quantify. Scenario data might not be available, and there are many more methodology options. So the uncertainty range will be much higher, and this information might not be as useful to stakeholders, so it doesn't need to be included in the report. So this last one is very specific to Singapore. So looking at how you can get support from the Sustainability Reporting Grant, which is set up by Enterprise Singapore. So the costs that are included in this grant allows up to 30% of costs capped at 150k, and includes various things within the cost involved in putting together an ISSB aligned sustainability report. In terms of the eligibility, so looking at companies listed on SGX or Singapore incorporated companies with annual revenue of at least 100 million. But I think maybe the most important eligibility criteria is it must be your first time creating a sustainability report that's aligned to the ISSB standards, and it must be before it's mandatory. So for example, for listed companies, looking at FY25 is when it's mandatory, then you can use the grant for FY24. So it's got to be before that period. So we just outlined that in the table on the screen as well. So that was the end of the section for us presenting. Just going to have a look to see if there's any Q&As in the chat. I think, yeah, one of the questions on here is around the best place to start. So we mentioned the gap analysis, considering all the S2 requirements kind of line by line, looking across those 4 pillars of governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. And a lot of companies have already aligned to TCFD, so considering where there is alignment already. Maybe where there's partial alignment, so further examples are needed, or where there's big pieces of work that need to be undertaken. And then I think from here it's just building out a roadmap for meeting all the requirements. So considering things like capability in the team, maybe other functions that need to be involved as well. So thinking about risk or finance or facilities, and considering some of the data inputs that will be needed for the disclosure as well. And then also linking this to other work that might be going on at the same time. And I think once companies have this plan in place, it seems a little bit more tangible and a little bit more practical to work with. And from our experience as well, working with sustainability teams, this gap analysis also gives kind of board and senior leaders throughout the business confidence that although the standards are new, the business is already somewhat aligned and there is progress in place. So just makes it slightly less scary. Maybe just looking at the time. Yeah, thank you so much for listening to the content of the webinar, and we hope that you found it useful. Please do reach out if you have any further questions. Just wanted to highlight that we are hosting a series of webinars across the course of the year, from things like quantifying financial impacts of risks and opportunities, how to integrate this into your risk management framework, and also looking at other elements like Scope 3 and climate transition planning as well. So please do look out for these across the course of the year as well. And again, do reach out if you've got any questions, and we can follow up on any further questions in the chat box as well. But thank you very much for joining.